First things first, man. Let's just go over the big news that I haven't touched on the live streams of this show yet, and that is the stadium renovations. So the upgraded stadium renovations, of course, originally slated for the south end zone, now moving along the east and west sidelines, and there's a lot of division on what the reasoning behind it is, or how people feel about it. Of course, the people in the South Stadium really upset because they wanted those renovations. But with your familiarity with the stadium, how do you feel about this?
Yeah, the stadium renovation is a debacle. It's a debacle the first time when Alberts implemented it. Ticket prices were on the rise anyways, but his whole plan was to renovate the South Stadium, as we saw, and to get it basically down from 90,000 capacity to around 70,000. A lot of fans were not happy with that, specifically because of the fact that 90,000 were still showing up to the games for the last couple of years, the worst season in Nebraska football history. And now when we're starting to get good again, he's taking up those ticket prices, and we're not going to have as many butts in the stands. Now, again, they try to change that with Troy Dan. That was the big talking point when he was hired by Nebraska. Is this going to get changed at all? Is it going to get moved back? Because originally under the new plan, or excuse me, the old plan was that the whole South Stadium was going to get blown up after this season. We would not have a South Stadium for the 2025 season. Now, obviously, like we saw earlier this week, that's no longer going to be the case. But the big thing that jumped out at me is the fact that they're no longer going to be focusing on South Stadium. Now, if you go to these games, if you're a regular Memorial Stadium like I am, the South Stadium is garbage. I mean, it's completely blocked off from the rest of the stadium. If you are sitting in the north, if you're sitting in the east or the west, you cannot physically walk over to South Stadium. If you are sitting in South Stadium, you have to walk through a different entrance. The facilities are garbage. You can't get food there. The restrooms are about as bad as anywhere in the stadium, and you're all just cramped in there. So the South Stadium needs renovations more than anything else. But under the new plan, they're focusing on the east-west side of the stadium. And I was talking to Justin before we got live. The reason why they're doing this is purely because of donors. We struggled so much getting donor support for the facility project a couple years ago. They're just finally finishing that up. And we had no donor support for the South Stadium because these big donors, the guys who are millionaires, have these big companies. Why would they give money to the South Stadium where they're not sitting? So they're putting it into the East Stadium. They're putting it into the West Stadium. And this is just as controversial as, again, the old plan, because the part of the stadium that needs the renovation the most are not getting any support.
Yeah. And that is, the people in the South Stadium and alike, they have been promised this upgrade. They think they're getting this upgrade, and now they see that there's no foreseeable upgrade on the horizon. That that I don't even know if they have a timeline, because they're starting this after the 2025 season. So a couple years from even starting that, and then once they get to that, then they have to come up with a plan for the South Stadium. So yeah, it's one of those things. It's like, I was one of the people that didn't necessarily like the lack of the 20,000 seats, but at this point, they have to go with the donors. They're at the mercy of the donors with stuff like this, and that's the downside.
And I'm a little old school. They always talk about making the fan experience better, but really what they're trying to do is make the donor experience better, right? At the end of the day, this is a college. This is for the students before anybody else. And a lot of times they just have the interest of what looks like the elite above everybody else. And I'm a guy who goes to almost every single home game. Yep. And you look at in my opinion, the rich seats, you look at the club seats in the West and East Stadium. Those are the parts of the stadium that are always the thinnest on game day, right? There's basically nobody there, especially, when we get later in the season for the colder games, nobody's showing out, but there's still people showing up in the North Stadium and the South Stadium. So again, just ticks me the wrong way. The fact they kind of had another debacle with this process. And we were talking about it as well before we got live, is that I really think a lot of this money that the donors are putting into the program, they should go to NIL, because that's what every single successful college football program is doing right now. Look at Missouri. Missouri's not historically a great program, and right now they're recruiting at an elite level at the top. I believe they have a top 10 recruiting class right now. They're getting 4-star, 5-star prospects like we've never seen before, and that's all thanks to their NIL fund that's coming in from Kansas City, St. Louis. So that's what we need to do, completely revamp our NIL. I know Troy Dan's working on that, but again, that's where all of our donor money should be going, is trying to make this program better than these stadium renovations that may or may not help us going forward.
Correct. Yeah, and that's the one thing about having to, the NIL is keeping the donors happy is very important, because most of the money, I don't think they take any money from the university to pay the players or for the NIL. It's strictly donor money. And so you got to be in their good graces, and that's the unnecessary nature of the beast. And that's just, I mean, that's with any business. They're gonna do what's best in the nature of their best interest in business, and that's what this has just become. It's more and more like a business at this point, and it's just, you got to keep the right people happy. Go ahead.
One thing I want to touch on about Memorial Stadium before we go on to the next topic is that I saw some on Twitter that I thought was a little bit funny. There were some Husker fans basically posing the question if we're going to get a new stadium sometime in the next 20, 30 years, given the fact that we've seen so many stadium renovations over the last couple of decades. And I thought that was ludicrous. Like, no, you cannot have a new stadium other than Memorial Stadium, because in order to do that, you have to tear down Memorial Stadium, basically build up a new stadium right where it is. There's not space to build a stadium.
No.
So just want to answer that. We're not building a new stadium ever. Like, I'm 18 years old. I will never see another stadium that Nebraska football plays in ever.
It's crazy to me, because Memorial Stadium's a mecca, right? And of course, like, it's going to come at it would come at a big cost. But to say, like, 20 years down the road, these stadium renovations that they're about to do are going to take, over half a decade probably to get all this figured out and sorted and be able to go renovate all the stadiums. So then they're going to turn around a little bit later and build another stadium. I don't see that either. That was in any future plans, they wouldn't spend this money on the stadium renovation. But yeah, we'll get into a little bit of let's slide over into the collective. I know you had something to talk about with the collective that you wanted to mention specifically to 1890, and we were both talking about some of the issues that we had with it in the beginning of the show. Straight away, just the branding of it initially, and then just the, I guess, lack of a pop when it was released and sent to the public after all the work that they put into it and all we heard about it. And then, of course, the tone deaf beef jerky game on Twitter. So yeah, what are your thoughts on the 1890 as it currently sits?
Yeah, that's another thing, though, where we look back on Trev Albert's tenure. You can, make that claim that he might have dropped the ball on that collective when we were starting that off. First off, like we just said, the branding is terrible. The 1890 collective, that doesn't pop, that doesn't get anybody excited. You don't want to rep that on your shirt. You don't want to rep that on your hat. The branding behind it is just about as bad as it comes. I mean, 1890, I assume that's when Nebraska football started playing. I think that's the whole, or maybe when Nebraska athletics started. I don't know if you know perhaps the meaning behind that, but the branding is awful. That's the number one thing. And the number two thing is the administration behind it is really, really not supported. Trev Alberts didn't do enough to support it. The coaches for Nebraska, you never saw them repping 1890. You never saw anybody around Lincoln repping that. Now, when Troy Dannon got here, he made that a point of emphasis to try to completely change Nebraska's NIL. He's already been astounded with just the development in Nebraska's culture, or identity compared to Washington. I mean, Washington went to the College Football Playoff last year, and he's finding it a lot easier to position Nebraska's brand rather than Washington's. That speaks volume. So he's trying to change Nebraska's NIL, trying to make it more of a popular thing that donors really feel excited about contributing to. He wants to include everybody. That you've seen that they're trying to, again, do that beef jerky thing, obviously, that puts some fans in the wrong direction because of what they did to Husk guys with their beef jerky. But again, they're trying to get everybody involved. They're trying to sell merch that might have the common fan contribute to the NIL collective. So I like what Troy Dan is doing, but again, it's always one step forward, two steps back, because they're always asking the donors for these renovations, for facilities, for stadium renovations. At the end of the day, we need to put 95% of our funds into that NIL, because that's what good programs are doing. That's what Missouri's doing. That's what Alabama's doing right now. That's what Georgia is doing. Okay, and a lot of these programs, like I just mentioned, in the SEC, even in the Big Ten, they're not having a big stadium renovation every single year like we are.
Correct.
They're just not doing that. They're putting all their money toward five-star prospects that they desperately need on their football team. Again, Missouri's not good. When Missouri started putting NIL money in their program, they weren't making bowl games. And already look at what they're doing. They just won a New York Six Bowl against Ohio State this year, and they're on the upswing as well. So we need to put all that money in NIL. Troy Dannon understands that. He's new school. I think one of the biggest flaws about Trev was he was old school. He had that old school approach. Troy understands what needs to be done in modern day college football. He understands that the NIL collective, it wasn't doing enough to support this program. And hopefully not only do we see the program start to have more NIL funding in football, but we need to see that in volleyball. We need to see that in basketball specifically. And one thing is that we have not seen that in baseball. I read an interesting article that there was a standout pitcher, I believe from Wichita State,
Mhm.
last offseason. He was interested in coming to Nebraska, and he basically gave Will Bolt a price tag. He said, hey, I'll come here for such and such money. Nebraska didn't have that. He ends up transferring over to TCU, and he's one of the best pitchers in the country right now. So,
Yeah.
again, we need that money flowing, not throughout football, but throughout all the rest of the programs because, as a Nebraska fan, I want to see Nebraska football good, but I also want to see every single sport for the Huskers doing well. So, again, we
Right.
need that NIL collective to get better, Justin.
And I mean, we even saw just when they had those 5-day push until signing day, and I think they set the goal at what was it? I can't remember, 500K or something like. I was probably way less than that, but I can't remember the actual goal. But they hit it, and I mean, with 2 days, they had 5 days to people to donate, and they hit it within like the third day or something like that. Like the potential is there if they can just be a little bit. I just think attention to detail is lacking. I think they expected to just be able to launch this and fans would just throw money at it because, it's attached to the university, it's attached to NIL, but they don't understand that like a lot of people still don't know what this thing even is, and unless like you have a lot of people that aren't on social media, where they push a lot of their stuff on social media. And I think even at that concert, that Zach Bryan concert that Rule went to, he had an 1890 hat on, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
And so like the coaches are even making a conscious effort to get out there and wear this stuff, kind of like you said before. They weren't even there, nobody was out there wearing it or even pushing this. So that's going to be huge for the future. And like you said, Dannon being very kind of new school, but I think he's a good combination of the two. Like he understands traditional college football, he understands what works in traditional college football, but he's just got that like new edge adaptability to him. And like you said, Trev was very structured in the way he operated. He was very set in his ways. Yeah. And, one of the things that Matt Rule had said that he loved about Trev was ahead of the curve and things coming up. And he was prepared for certain things that weren't necessarily even in discussion, but he knew that they would be coming on the horizon just in the nature of the way these things work. And it seems like Troy Dan is very similar in that operation. He's very forward thinking, right? Even with the stuff like the stadium renovations and all that stuff, like he's not coming out and necessarily saying we've got a plan for y'all. He's still leaving it up to like we're going to figure out a plan as we go. And I think he's just willing to put his neck out there and be able to make these decisions. And that's what I respect, him coming in here and putting his neck out there, willing to make these decisions, and albeit hopefully for the betterment of the athletic department. But I do agree, like Troy, he's an excellent athletic director, and he's gonna help this collective mightily. It could have been the old school nature of Trev as to why he didn't push it. But I don't think Trev was hesitant in NIL, but there's no way to know, especially with the way he exited. There's no way to know where his head was at with any of this.
I just go back to when they were introducing NIL, I believe 2020, summer when NIL was just first coming up. And, they make these top 10 lists you'd see on YouTube, on Twitter, top 10 programs that will benefit most from NIL. Nebraska was always on those top 10 lists because, the donor money is there. We have more money flowing throughout our program than just about anybody else. But as of right now, if we're to make a top 30 list of, programs that are being benefited by NIL, do we even make that list? I don't believe we do. Troy Dan understands that. He understands how big Nebraska's potential is. I mean, he's a guy who's worked his way up through the ranks. He was at Tulane. He was at Washington. He understands that, no place that he's been is like Nebraska. Nobody has a ceiling like Nebraska, and he's going to try to hit that.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And to your point, that's what also makes it hard to compete with. Like, we got a good group of guys coming in here. We're trying to compete with schools like Texas, but like Texas's resources, like top everybody in the country, like the resources that they have there. So, to be able to win those battles, it's gonna have to start happening where Nebraska climbs up in that upper echelon to be able to make sure that not only they were able to go get guys, but they're also able to keep guys. That's another thing that we need to worry about is retention and these guys not being plucked away from the university. But one of the things that I do like about Matt Rule's style is he's very much about, he makes it about the culture and the family and the fit, and I think that's why more people are willing to stay, and he has their best interest in heart. So hopefully that, I think that's part of the reason why you didn't see a lot of players or coaches get plucked away in this offseason, just because like they know he has their best interest in heart. And maybe they're not going to be able to make more money now necessarily, but they have a better future ahead of them and potential for more money down the road. I don't know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I go back to when Dylan Raiola committed to Nebraska, and I'm not sure how true this is. There's a lot of rumors flying out, but his whole holdup because he wanted to come to Nebraska around December was how much the Huskers were actually willing to pay him at NIL, because he was getting a certain price tag at Georgia. He had a meeting with Matt Rule to discuss his payment, him and his dad. Now, again, not sure how true that is. Obviously, there's a lot of smoke around that situation to this day, but it just goes back to the fact that, Matt Rule, despite the lack of NIL funding, the lack of potential, yeah, he's still recruiting at a high level because of those connections, like you just mentioned, because of that, that ground, or excuse me, those, grassroots connections, not only with those kids, but with those parents, with those high school coaches. That's really where Matt Rule flourishes. And you've already seen that for Nebraska. And we're trying to land, top 15 class, something we haven't done in a very long time.